All right, so the war has started. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand is killed. The war has started. Everyone's declared war on each other, and here we go. The race to sea. So German starts with their Schlieffen plan, moves in towards Paris, goes through Belgium, which remember brings the Brits into the war, and they get stopped just outside of Paris. At that point, they basically try to outflank each other, which means they basically try to surround the other side, and they both just kind of end up in this race going towards the British Channel or the English Channel, basically, and they just start digging in, and it becomes a really defensive war. Let me show that to you in a map, quick. So if you look up here, here's Paris, here's Germany, Germany attacking Paris. Okay, so here we go. Here they come. This is the Schlieffen plan. They're doing the Schlieffen plan. Okay. Then, so it's pretty dang close to what happened. Then the Allies, which is France and Great Britain, come back, and they're going to fight back against this. And then what happens is they start going back, and this line is going to get set. And you can see there's the furthest line, and then this leads to them digging in against each other. They're going to dig in against each other, and then they are going to have what is called a very defensive war, and it's not going to be very good. Also during this time, the Italians joined the neutral side because at first they were neutral, but then they get control of what's called Southern Trio and a coast which were originally owned by Austria-Hungary, but had kind of changed or had already been conquered. And Italy had also didn't agree with the war itself at first. Now, a major part of this war is the technology piece. Now, the war itself and the Western Front, so where you see on the when you'll see here on like the German-French border almost in this area, what you have, oops, wrong button, there we go, is it's trench warfare. What trench warfare is, and I'll show you here, trench warfare, here we go, you dig in, you dig down into the ground. Each side is across from each other, and then they would literally run at each other. They would literally run at each other across no man's land. No man's land is the area in between. It'd be full of barbed wire and booby traps and just awfulness. So, all right, here's itself. Here's no man's land. Here's the exterior trench. This is one side of it. This would be repeated on the other side of no man's land. And it was just disastrous because you'd have machine guns, which were invented at this time, barbed wire, mustard gas, submarine, tanks, planes, gas masks. All these different pieces of technology are invented in some way or another. It's a highly defensive war. They would literally get killed for inches at a time. To show you some of the inventions. So these are the trenches themselves, and you can start to see here just the grossness associated with this. It's going to cause a lot of damage to human life because they will start using poison gas, mustard gas against the other side because the people were trapped. I mean, they're in those trenches, which are disgusting. Mice, rats, lice, you name it, that's what was in the trench. Okay, here's a pretty good angle of the trenches for you. You can see that they're taller than the person. I mean, it's defensive. You're trying to stop the other people from going in. You're trying to stop the other people from going in. Here's some of the other inventions. Okay, you have, first of all, the Zeppelins. The Germans use these Zeppelins to bomb Paris. You see some artillery fire, which are also used for longer distance. Barbed wire to try to not let people get across. Remember, before, barbed wire had been used to stop cattle. Now they're using it to stop humans. Airplanes, we didn't really have the full power that airplanes are going to have during World War II. It's them and tanks are both going to start here. Tanks were meant to get across no man's land, but they're not very mobile yet. And tanks are more or less just used for reconnaissance. There are some ace fighters, dog fighters, etc., but not a ton of stuff. These are gas masks. God, I cannot emphasize enough just how disgusting of a war this is. It's highly defensive. Really, the only time you have any sort of major offensive in the Western Front is the Battle of Verdun. It's basically the French not letting the Germans pass. I'm sorry, the French are going to try to get past. The French and the British are going to try to get past the Germans. They're attempting to break through that no man's land. The French lose 315,000 men. The Germans lose 280,000 men just to gain a couple miles. just to gain a couple miles. The French got that, and then the British counterattack. I mean, it is not good. Battle of Verdun, German offensive, French win the Battle of High Cost, and then the British counterattack the Battle of Somme. It is not good at all. There's new naval rules. For the first time, the British are going to blockade the Germans. The British are going to blockade the Germans, so in other words, the German people are going to start to suffer in this war. And it was really, the line, for the first time, you're going to start to see lines drawn between who is a civilian and who is a part of the military. Because you also have, they're going to start bombing civilians. And part of the reason you're going to start bombing civilians and all that is the fact this is the first example of what is called a total war, when all efforts are going, the entire society are going to the war. They're bringing in new recruits. They're forcing people to fight in the war. They're going to take over private companies and have them produce tanks. There's something for the war, whether that's planning boards. They would make quotas. So in other words, like basic goods would not be taken care of because everything was going for the war. All the raw materials like tires and things like that, instead of going for the car, would go for the rubber, would go for the tanks. And since all the men have gone to the war front, you now have women taking over postal work, police work, nurses, physicians, clerks. They're making shells and TNT and explosives. That's going to be important because you think about this. What they're doing is they are putting themselves at line, and they aren't getting some of the freedoms after the war. In Russia, they're even using women as soldiers. So women are promised a lot of things, but then after the war, even they don't get a lot of them. They don't get a lot of them. The war is seen as kind of glorious at times, but in reality, it was not at all. Okay, the French foreign prime minister suggested that there's the best interest of France to sign a peace treaty for a while, and he was put in jail for 2 years. That's an example of censorship. The London Times, as some examples of propaganda, the London Times said that Germans converted corpses to fertilizer, into food. The Germans show that Allied soldiers just doing brutal things and raping women. They tried to show the Russians as barbarians. I got some examples here. Okay, of just propaganda pieces that are going on. Okay. Now, the Eastern Front is a little more fluid than the Western Front in that it isn't just pure atrocities with no defensive lands. However, the Russians are losing. The Russians are losing a lot to the Germans. Where in the West, you're basically neutral with a little bit of Allied advance. I'm sorry, in the West side. In the Eastern Front, that is not the case. In the Eastern Front, you see Russia losing. Russia is losing all over the place, which is going to lead to some changes in Russia. Now, this is a world war, and so it is going to spread. In East Asia and in the Pacific, the colonies are getting involved, resources and human needs. The British are sending troops. Japan wants to secure an enduring peace. Enduring peace in Eastern Asia, and they send an ultimatum to the Germans. And Japan takes the German territories. Germany couldn't go fight. So Japan wanted, and Germany takes advantage. And they're going to take a bunch of islands, and it's pretty easy for them. Japan's taking colonies from Germany, so now they think they're going to go to China. So on January 18th, 1915, they actually present some demands to China. And if we think of what we know, Japan is way more industrialized than China. Japan could have taken China. And the demands those 21 demands basically would have had Japan conquers China, and they kind of just become a puppet to, or China becomes Japan's puppet. And Japan would get monopolies on basically all the industrial stuff, palaces, government. Japan would be the only Japanese would have guns. However, China leaks the note to the British. And remember, the British and the Chinese kind of have this interesting relationship going on. And Britain intervenes and doesn't let it happen. So think about that. That's going to be a precursor to World War II with what we see. That Japan and the British are going to be on opposite sides of things. Now, the war is also taking place in Africa and in Southwest Asia. And Germany is losing. They're going to lose colonies in Southwest Africa, East Africa, Cameroon, Togoland. It's difficult conquest. The British are using troops from and the Belgians are there as well. There are Arab soldiers, there are African soldiers. This is truly a multiple front, and their colonies are helping their imperial power. Winston Churchill leads the British Navy in the Dardanelles. The Dardanelles are up in here, and this is against the Ottoman Empire. The British are trying to open up their supply lines to Russia, and they think they can do this to get past the Ottomans. And where they do is they get to a place called Gallipoli. At Gallipoli, they do not get through, and the Ottomans defeat them. And it doesn't work. They're going to lose 250,000 people. And most of them are Canadian, New Zealand, and Australian. So let's think about this. Those are all the imperial powers. Are all the people underneath the British. You should start to see a theme here. This isn't still to this day known as Anzac Day in Australia and New Zealand, that they are not happy about this. Now, the Armenian Genocide. The Armenian Genocide was the last major non-Muslim ethnic group in the Ottoman Empire. Remember, the Ottoman Empire was ruled by the Young Turks at this point, and the Young Turks were all about Turkish. And so the Turks are trying to establish this. They're going to kill 1 million Armenians. There were forced migrations, starvations, dehydrations, and exposure. Now, the Ottomans as a whole, so the Ottomans are going to lose ground to the Russians and the British. The Ottomans might be able to stop them at Gallipoli, but you have the Egyptian, Indian, Australian, and New Zealand troops help to get rid of the Ottomans out of the Suez Canal in Palestine, and Britain's going to help in an Arab revolt against the Turks. And so what happens is the British are going to have a ton of power in the Middle East. That's going to be important later as we move forward, because how to break up the Ottoman Empire, the British and the French are going to have direct impacts on what those borders are going to look like. All right, so what should you know from this slide? First of all, realize it's a world war. All the colonies are involved. You have propaganda going on at home. The women are filling the roles. It's a bloody, brutal war with these new technologies that are in place. The big losers so far: Ottomans and the Russians. The Russians are losing men and women left and right on the British front, and the Tsar is losing power, and the Ottomans have basically been destroyed by this point. And you're still at a stalemate in the West, with the Russians are gonna fall out pretty quickly.